I'm speaking as a biologist, and therefore I want to give you some biology to start with, because it is why my view is as I will put it to you. Well, the current situation. Somebody in the series last year spoke about the perfect storm which the human species faces. The storm of economic problems, of climate change, of population, of food supply, all of those coming together. And there are huge political and social issues which have to engage us absolutely now, at this moment. And you might feel, many people do feel, that to talk about the numbers of people, of population growth and so on at this time is completely wrong. That's not the priority. The point of view which I wish to put to you is that the trouble with population is that it's not a crisis, it's an insidious change. We are unaware of the extra strains which are put upon the global society and the planet by those 200,000 extra who arrive every day. Nevertheless, it's there. My point is that it will never go away unless we begin to take issue. So I think that we must begin now. The time to begin is always 50 years ago. Now, because I want to talk about population control and limitations, I must begin by recommending all of you to have a look at this article, reproduced, Fremlin's article. He's a physicist, nuclear physicist from Birmingham. He's dead now. But he put out this article in a deliberately provocative way. He takes nothing into account at all except the physical constraints of being alive and staying alive on the planet. And there are all kinds of problems about access to minerals, to water, to food, and so on. And in the end, of course, everything has to be subsumed to that cause. There's no waste. Everything is recycled. You have to eat bodies, of course, because they're a source of nutrient. You have to cover over the oceans because they're the heat sink. And if the limit comes, as he points out here, about 10 to the 16, 10 to the 18, when you can't keep cool. The oceans have boiled. By that point, as he indicates, we would be 120 people to every square metre. Now, obviously, we would not be living, we'd be living, even if you think of those high-rise, ludicrous places in Dubai, this would be really high-rise stuff we're talking of there. We're up in the stratosphere. Okay, my point I wish to make from this is, clearly that's not going to happen. And clearly nobody would want it to happen. So it's like the old gag about, you know, haggling with a woman. Will you sleep with me for 10 bob? Will you sleep with me for £100,000? We're just haggling about the price. Here, we're just haggling about the figure, aren't we? Nobody can possibly believe that our population could or should go on growing. Right, but we have to start from where we are. And I have a real problem when I try to put across, and people of my view try to put across our ideas. If I go to somebody and try to engage them, somebody in the environmental movement, in Friends of the Earth, or Worldwide Fund for Nature, or Save the Children, or CAFOD, or Christian Aid, and I say to them, there is a real problem with population. These are the answers they will come up with, almost invariably. And the asymmetry is because if one of them comes up to me and tries to say, look, children are in need, there's a lot of hunger in the world, will you subscribe? I don't say, it's not hunger, it's not poverty, it's population. People seem incapable of recognizing that what is not sufficient is nevertheless absolutely necessary. And in fact, from Professor Roger Jeffrey last year was talking about the IPAC formula. And he was arguing that it was wrong of us to concentrate on population simply because we wish to keep affluence. that in fact you could reduce affluence and you could leave the population as it was. That was the inference I gained from his remark. I believe that's profoundly wrong. No biologist would think that. But there is this asymmetry, and I want you to be aware of it, ladies and gentlemen, because if you look at the environmental charities, to date, none of them mention the problem of human numbers. It's there at the back of the back, and if you begin talking to them, they'll begin to make some acknowledgements. But they believe, because this is a so-called sensitive issue, that if they emphasize population in any way, they will not get so many subscriptions, and they may well be right. So a biologist cannot see it in that way because biologists believe that the world is already grossly overpopulated. The human beings and their domestic animals, they form a gigantic proportion of the biomass of terrestrial animals. We are grossly out of balance with the planet. And most estimates would suggest that already we are using up the resources of about 1.3 to 1.5 planet Earths. We are living on capital, and it's not being renewed. So, it is absolutely fatuous to stick to this formula and say, look, it's affluence that's the problem. Every little Briton consumes 16 times as much as every little Bangladeshi. Sure, that's right. But does that mean that the Bangladeshis should just stay as they are? Don't we want them all to become much wealthier and live at a standard which is more comparable to our own? And what is that going to do about the planet? Okay, you will already determine that I'm not talking straight science here. I'm talking opinions, biologically based opinions. Aldo Leopold is an important person for most biologists, and here is one of his most telling statements, and I've often felt it. We do live in a world of wounds, and it's distressing, extremely distressing, and therefore many people are just unaware of it. Leopold is completely correct. Two animals that live in Southeast Asia just hang on in Southeast Asia. There may be 200 to 300 Sumatran rhinos and a few hundred more proboscis monkeys. I think the chances of their surviving are very slim under present trends. Now, for many of you, well, I expect many of you are not aware that such animals exist and share the planet with us at the moment. And many more, I'm not accusing you, I'm thinking of the audience outside, couldn't care less whether they exist or not. In which case, they are luckier than I am. For me, it is a sense of sorrow that they will not be around much longer, for reasons entirely of our numbers times greed. Okay, now when you talk about extinction rates, this is one of the frightening things that biologists come across, you must be fairly hard-nosed. I'm a bit tired of people desperately concerned about the planet, really deep greens, and I remember one who got up in a lecture being given by Bob May, who was then the president of the Royal Society, and a pretty hard man. He needed to be dealt with gently. And somebody said, you're talking about extinction entirely in the abstract. Don't you realize that whilst you've been talking, 7 species have gone extinct? To which May's response was, can you name one of them? Collapse of Green Party. Of course not. You can easily come up with statistics like that. The people we rely on, here's May and Lawton's book, an excellent account of the science of extinction and what is going on at the moment. And here is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature painstakingly trying to look at the serious data of what's actually going on. And they've managed to survey about nearly 50,000 species. And I assure you they've gone to experts, people on the ground who have some real possibility to census on a repeated basis so that you can get a good idea of what trends are going on. And you can see they've got a classification here, and we will see that some are extinct, rather few at the moment, critically endangered, vulnerable, and so on. Now this is the kind of statistic that one needs to be able to put across to governments or conservation bodies if you're trying to get some really well-established scientific basis for the policies that you're taking. It's not easy to come by, but nobody could look at a figure like this with this about 50% nearly of the species which they've looked at, which are all in an endangered category. This looks like the beginning of a storm. And indeed, many biologists believe that the 6th mass extinction is already in progress, with extinction rates, as May and Lawton have suggested, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude greater than that in the fossil record. So things are going wrong. This is the biological basis of my concern about human numbers. Now, just what happens? This is probably to increase palm oil production because the demands for palm oil are increasing enormously. It's visible, well, some operation is visible from space. Here's a wonderful photograph picture taken from the spaceship which was heading out towards Mercury. You remember a wonderful trajectory it had to take. It had to flip round the Earth and get a slingshot from the Earth's gravity as it goes off towards Mercury. Anyway, this is the shot. This is the west coast of South America, and you can see this is the most severe desert in the world. There's no cloud, no rain ever here. But here's the Amazon basin. And look, these are not clouds, not natural clouds, they're smoke. This is the Amazon burning. And the Brazilian government, in collaboration with other governments, is doing its best, but it's been doing its best for 40 years and not very much to show for it. We're living on capital. And it's quite obvious that good soils, water supply, climate are all under strain. Now, there are other areas where we've had to reduce the natural habitat for our own purposes. And that is Canada, the wheat prairies, and this is Lincolnshire prairies. Now, we need that, ladies and gentlemen. We have to exploit all the good agricultural land we've got. We have to hammer that land. And because of the situation which we find ourselves with, roughly at the moment 1 billion inadequately fed, and that increasing rapidly, we have to hammer the land. And certain preferred green routes, shall we say, like organic agriculture, are just for the birds. We cannot afford that. We have to go for GM and for artificial fertilizer to get us through the hump. Maybe 50, 100 years down the line, we can change back, but we can't do it at the moment. And we mustn't criticize the agricultural industry. We can ask them to take certain things into consideration if we have an opportunity, but we rely on the barley barons. So, my worry about the 6th mass extinction is, of course, that it's the charismatic animals that will go. Our quality of life and that of our children is the ones that will immediately suffer. We won't be aware of most of the extinctions, but we'll be aware when the tiger no longer lives in the wild and when the elephants are threatened. Our quality of life will go. There's an aesthetic component to this, as well as a hard biological one. Now, let me not underestimate the huge efforts which people are going into to try to reverse this situation. There are enormous amounts of activity. Biologists, non-specialist people trying to conserve, trying to get some sort of protection for the natural world, trying to reduce erosion, get better methods of agriculture, and so on. It is not all bad news. I recommend publications by the International Institute of Environment and Development. Much excellent work based in London, much excellent work, particularly in Sahelian Africa, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and so on. And you can see there are good studies which suggest that population increase in these areas, which is very rapid, isn't always immediately bad news. What's happening is that traditional methods of agriculture are being recognized as the way forward, not high-tech deep ploughing and so on, but in fact planting holes which enable you to conserve water and to fertilize with mulch and crop residues. And of course the traditional terracing, which has been going on for millennia in parts of the Far East and producing huge crops. It requires a lot of people. It's very labor intensive, but that's not a bad thing in the short term because there's an awful lot of people around. The problem comes, of course, in that in the end, unless the population stabilizes and fairly quickly, it will be swamped. But there is good news for the moment, and if we get the right lessons from it, we shall achieve something. But look, we must be realistic. I showed you pictures of forests being cleared for palm oil plantation. There was a symposium in May this year, Sustainable Palm Oil, Challenges, a Common Vision and the Way Forward, organised by the Zoological Society of London. An admirable effort. But it says this at one point: insatiable demand for vegetable oil combined with high yields and profitability means that palm oil expansion is set to continue. Yet the predicted scale of expansion makes it a strong contender for the single greatest threat to biodiversity on the planet. How can these socio-economic and environmental goals be reconciled? Well, I'm afraid the short answer is that they cannot. Something has to give. Either the demand must go down or the biodiversity will disappear. We watch that space. But don't count on it for the Sumatran rhino and the proboscis monkey, both of whom live in areas where such clearance is taking place now. Okay, that's what we do, and we're all, I think, in our hearts aware that we're doing that. Human beings are extremely good at denial. We can go on as hitherto, and we search for the return to the status quo ante, particularly at the moment. But of course, every aspect of our denial is linked to the fact that we are hooked upon growth. Population growth and economic growth go together. Economists in general like growing populations because there are more producers and more consumers, and everybody supposedly gets rich. Now, I'm not here to knock economists. I have a great respect for them, but I recognise, they must recognise, that it is not an exact science. You will be well aware at the moment that the complexities of economic modelling almost parallel those of climate modelling. And on any issue, should we cut now and reduce the deficit? Should we spend in order to get economic growth going? You will find economists on each side of the argument, probably a Nobel laureate on each side of the argument as well. Now, this ought to give economists a little bit of caution. If there's so much disagreement, the certainties may be somewhat illusory. And economists whom I've attempted to discuss with will tell me that I have really little idea about economics, and that's absolutely right. Do you remember a few years ago there was an attempt to select, the BBC select Britain's favourite poem, and it came the attempt was made quite soon after that wonderful film Four Weddings and a Funeral came out, and everybody expected that W.H. Auden's wonderful mournful poem there, switch off the lights, turn off the lights, switch off the telephones, or that would be a winner because it was spoken superbly in that film. But no, it wasn't that. It was old Kipling. They went back, the British public went back enormously. It was a huge surplus of people voting for Kipling's poem, If, which I don't like very much. But anyway, at the time, there was a lot of notices were appearing in people's offices, postcards, witty postcards. You don't have to be an idiot to work here, but it helps, and that sort of thing, you remember. Well, one that I like particularly, if you can keep your head while all about you are losing theirs, maybe you don't understand the situation. And this is what I would say to economists who accuse me simply of being ignorant of economics. Boy, are they ignorant of biology. The constraints which we have to live with are these. This is the starting point. That's what we've got, okay? And it's a pretty lonely place, is it not? We can't rely on expanding it much. We're scraping around on the surface, doing the best we can, but in the end, that's all that there is. And so economics must understand the planet and must recognize the constraints. Sometimes what economists say almost beggars belief to me. In their house magazine, The Economist, with some excellent writing in it, I acknowledge that, in October last year, writing about India compared to China. There are two reasons why India will soon start to outpace China. One is demography. China's workforce will shortly start aging. In a few years' time, it will start shrinking. That's because of its one-child policy. Indira Gandhi's tried something similar in India when she called a state of emergency and so on. There was an uproar of protest. Democracy was restored and coercive population policies were abandoned. India is now blessed with a young and growing workforce. Its dependency ratio, the proportion of children and old people to working age adults, is one of the best in the world and will remain so for a generation. India's economy will benefit from this demographic dividend, which has powered many of Asia's economic miracles. The same week, details appeared of the malnutrition in Asia. In India, an average of 30% of children between up to the age of 5 were underweight, and in many areas of India, more than 50% of children were underweight. In China, anywhere less than 10%. Now that surely to anybody who's a member of the human race, particularly medically or biologically concerned, would indicate that this is a simplistic and in the end ridiculous argument. Unsustainable. Okay, I'm not arguing for biologists to rule the world. I'm really not. But I do believe that economic planning, social planning of all kinds should listen to what biologists have to say. We should have an input because our input is a bit different and it will help, I think, for the construction of a long-term future. Two very good books which you might like to look at examine history from a biological point of view. We've got, of course, a long history of civilizations which have flourished and then failed. Ours may do the same, may not. But if it does fail, it will fail, of course, for completely different reasons. But the fact is that previous civilizations have taken no account of the biological constraints that faced them. They were not in a position to do so. In his Jared Diamond's book, the case study which he takes particularly is that of Easter Island. He says that you can regard it as a little microcosm of the world. Here were this group of people. They got there somehow, and they were 1,200 miles from any nearest land. And their economy, their whole society, depended upon the use of trees. And there was one endemic species of tree on the island. and must have covered the island. All the pollen records, in fact, show that. But they began to cut them down and cut them down and cut them down. And Jared Diamond speculates. He wonders what the Easter Islander felt who was cutting down the last tree. Did he realise what was happening? But that is a kind of problem which is just a microcosm of how we don't want to find ourselves. Let me conclude this brief economic section by saying that there really are some ecologists who think strongly about this. Tim Jackson from the University of Surrey has got a splendid book, Prosperity Without Growth. And he was the economic advisor on the government sustainability committee, which has been axed as one of the quangos that was cut out. But Tim Jackson was in fact echoing some of the work in the 1970s of Kenneth Boulding. He talked about an economy of stock, which we must move through from the economy of throughput. And I asked an economist recently about Kenneth Boulding, and he said, that's a name I haven't heard of for decades. He said, I don't think you'll find one university course in Britain that mentions him. No. Now, I want to move on the second part here to talking about numbers and actions. Now, there is something happening. As you will know, the United Nations has had several international meetings. The first one was Rio back in 1972, and then there have been many others since. And vested interests kept the discussion of population per se off the agenda. It was all environment, health, women's rights, pollution, and so on. But by 1994, the pressure really was growing. And at Cairo, we had a discussion which did involve population. It came out with some declarations, one of which I will just quote to you. It's on the chapter on reproductive rights and reproductive health. Reproductive rights embrace certain human rights that are already recognized in national laws. These rights rest on the recognition of the basic right of all couples and individuals to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing, and timing of their children, and to have information and means to do so. They also include the right of all to make decisions concerning reproduction free of discrimination, coercion, or violence, and so on. One could not disagree with that. One would merely say that we're a little short on making sure that everybody has the information and the means to carry out that right. However, it's beginning. That was 94, well, 17 years ago, okay? And gradually, I think you'll agree, the topic of human numbers is rising a little higher on the agenda. And I want to take two extreme cases of population. The first is an obvious one. This is Ethiopia. Ethiopia in 2010. We know it well because, of course, of Bob Geldof and Band-Aid. 1985, perhaps the first and most dramatic time in which the images of starving children appeared on our screens. The population then in Ethiopia was 44 million. It's now doubled, and in 2011 it's actually more than 88 million. And here's the population profile, and of course such profiles indicate the degree of momentum which there is in a population. All this proportion, which must be more than 50%, haven't yet started to have children themselves. So the growth potential here is gigantic if there's enough food. And of course there's not been enough food at intervals, and the West has been piling stuff in. Now my view is that the feelings of rich Western guilt here are simply not sufficient. It is not enough just to say, this is terrible, we must feed. We must do that, certainly, but we can't leave it there. And I was extremely glad to see that the all-party group on population development and reproductive health, that's a House of Commons, House of Lords joint lot, 2 or 3 people, Baroness Tongue and Richard Ottaway, pointed out that although they didn't want to be called Malthusians, they recognised that actually family planning provision here must be an essential part of any aid. Now it happens that in Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi has been the president for over 20 years, and he's still there. And the aid agencies that work in Ethiopia commonly report that they have difficulty in getting material through. They are blocked. Zenawi probably has his own policy here. He's looking towards Somalia on his eastern flank, Sudan, and he was looking strongly, I'm sure, towards Egypt and Libya. We have the absolute right, I think, as fellow dwellers on the planet, to point out to the Ethiopians that something else has to happen apart from food aid. And of course that means that something else has to happen from us as well, and we shall be making that clear at the same time. But it simply is not enough. Bob Geldof says he's not going to run another Band-Aid. He must be a dispirited man. But nobody could achieve anything with population growth of this kind. It's in a very fragile part of the world in which climate is extremely problematic at the best of times. Hard to know, very hard to predict what will happen as a result of global warming. So, case 2, our first duty is to put our own house in order. When I first became interested in population matters, I went around like the poor man's Paul Ehrlich, giving talks here, there and everybody about population. Most people regarded the population problem as being out there. It was in the poor south. That's where they are. And Britain was, well, we've only got 55, 60 million. What are we worried about? You know, Egypt has overstripped us. It's now 83 and so on. But that's no longer tenable and no longer possible, nor has it been ever. And I have to say, to the Conservation Society's credit, it recognised from the word go that Britain's population was also a problem at that time. Now, our own house, a very different population profile. Here we are, this is 2010 for us as well. One can see, first of all, we live a lot longer than many of the Ethiopians do. That's not surprising. We had various booms of the baby boom era and so on, but of late, over the last 20, 25 years, the birth rate has been falling. And governments beginning to look at that, and this is a very typical profile for any of the European countries, including Russia. Governments look at that and they look down here and they get really worried. You know the issue, it's the pension problem. Who's going to pay for our pensions when we're all of us old? Britain's now 63 million and rising, and the estimates of 70 million by 2030 or so. Now the pension problem is a serious one, I don't deny it, but it's tied up altogether with our feelings that we long for growth in an economic sense, and growing populations, a factory which is taking on more people, a village in the highlands which is flourishing. Those are good signs, and bad signs are when the village has no longer got any young people in it, it's declining. I'm not denying that I share many of those feelings. I'm merely trying to look at the biological reality of it. We have to get used, I think, to a declining population. But what has been governments' attitudes towards this kind of decline? Many of them, Australia, Germany, Japan, trying to increase the birth rate at the moment. Sweden and France have done so in the past. I was particularly taken with Australia. I met an Australian at an environmental meeting recently. He said that the Minister for the Interior is trying to increase the birth rate in Australia. They're worried about declining population, and the slogan is one for mum, have one for mum, one for dad, and one for Australia. That is a political view of the situation facing human beings living on planet Earth. If you think of increasing the birth rate here to improve the pension ratios here, what happens when these people grow up? It is, of course, something that Bernie Madoff would recognise immediately. This is a Ponzi scheme. You pay off the interest to the older contributors by taking on new contributors. It is totally risible. If it weren't such a serious matter, you would wonder how somebody could stand up and look you in the face and say that what Britain needs is more young people. So, I'm not speaking of the employment levels in young people now. That might be something else they wish to take on hand. Now, most of Europe, if it was left for itself, would slowly decline. Our birth rates are below replacement level. And Britain's was as well, until quite recently. There's a step here, and in fact birth rates in Britain have gone up. And it's no use pussyfooting around it, 25% of the births in Britain now come from mothers who were not born in Britain themselves. So there's a change going on, and I think there's a message there for the mothers who were not born in Britain as well. It's unsustainable. So, how do we feel about our population? Well, the Optimum Population Trust recently commissioned a survey by YouGov, and here are the results. And you know what these things are like. This is 3,500 adults, all balanced for place of living, social class, income, and so on. And there are the figures, and they're, I think, quite interesting. It's interesting to compare Scotland with England and Wales and Northern Ireland, isn't it? But anyway, very few people believe that Britain would be better with more people in it. And a large mode think it would be better with fewer. That is at least a point to begin from, isn't it? Now, of course, what's behind these figures and how people in their own lives and minds interpret them and feel about them is something quite different. One can't say from this straight away 65% of people in Britain want the birth rate to fall and our numbers to decline. The question wasn't put like that. The question was put, you know, would the UK be... And if one looks at what people said about why they had made the decision they said, people were worried about increased population leading to more congestion, to more unemployment, to lack of affordable housing, to social conflict, to a poorer quality of life, and loss of open spaces and access to the natural world. All of those things, and everybody would have their own combination of such factors. But there's no question that people are beginning to think about it hard, and quite commonly one hears in common parlance terms like this overpopulated island and so on. So it's beginning. Now, as I say, none of it's straightforward, but as an interesting side question, in fact, 78% of people who were questioned said that they would be prepared to change their lifestyle. Well, maybe is my response to that, and certainly I don't think many of our politicians would believe that when they dangle things before us in the next party manifestos. Now, in terms of how we get on, this is family size in Britain at the moment, and it wouldn't take very much to shift that in a downward direction. My opinion, it's obvious, is that the UK would be better with a slowly declining population, and the previous name of Population Matters was the Optimum Population Trust, which raises the question, what is the optimum population for Britain or for anywhere else in that matter? Well, I'm forced to give a figure. I would say 20 million, about a third of what we have at the moment. Interestingly enough, I went back to look at a book, 1970, the Institute of Biology had a symposium on the optimum population for Britain. and the consensus was 20 million. That was 40 years ago, when the population was many tens of millions less than it is now. So the first step, in fact almost the only step I think one can realistically get at this moment, is an acceptance that a decline in our population is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. It's a huge opportunity to use the people who are here better than they're used at the moment. They have much more potential. So I was struck here about a comment that Richard Milne made in his lecture about climate change and the difference between scepticism and denial. He referred back to a comment which had been made in discussion by a previous lecturer in the series, Stuart Hazeldine, who was talking about carbon capture and so on. And in response to a questioner as to why so little was actually being achieved in the terms of carbon dioxide, meeting carbon dioxide targets, Professor Hazeldine said this: "At the moment, it is socially acceptable to put all that CO2 into the atmosphere." Exactly. It is socially acceptable to put CO2 into the atmosphere. As we drive away in the cars, we know that people won't criticise for being in a car, but in fact we know that it is not the best thing, but it's all we can do at the moment. Now, in just the same way, at the moment, it is socially acceptable to have any family size you like. Accidents, accidental, oh well, he was a bit of an accident, or a bit of a nudge. It isn't a thing that worries us. All that has got to change, in my view. I was horrified by a piece in the last Saturday's Guardian magazine, well, a piece by somebody who simply calls himself father of a third child. I bet that's a handful, men say when I tell them I've recently become a father of 3. What's it like? I smile and tell them how the 2 girls adore their younger brother. And so it goes on down. I gave in to my wife's ever-increasing desire for 3, when really I felt that 2 was more than enough. Poor guy. I feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for us as well. I feel sorry in all kinds of ways. But that is reproduction. That, how could one possibly interfere in a matter of such delicate, sensitive choice? But what kind of a choice was this? We can be quite sure that the planet, well, UK, let alone the planet, was not taken into order. Now, along with this social acceptability, there is a ghastly cult of maternity, reproduction, the joy of motherhood, all of which is there, of course. It really is. Children are marvellous, the joy they bring into people's lives. I'm not knocking that. What I'm saying is that everything in moderation, okay? Now, there are a couple of 2 old headlines which I dug up years ago. And they show something which is actually quite important in terms of Britain's population. Well, the Sun magazine, you see, that was wonderful. It's a happy issue. Wonderful, good for old Linda. She's finally got a daughter. And it happens at the upper ends of society as well. Here's the Countess, tears of joy. She's produced 5 girls and at last she's got a boy, and we are supposed to celebrate with her. Now, we know from the statistics that in families of 3 or above, the first 2 children are significantly more of the same sex. In other words, a great number of children in Britain are born because of the parents' desire to have children of both sexes. It's a luxury, I think, that we can no longer afford. We're just beginning to get at an attempt to face these awkward, difficult issues. It is important we need to get numbers right up at the front of our discussion. Childbearing is not just a personal matter anymore. How can we possibly say that children are your own, it's a matter of your own personal choice, when in fact, of course, if things go wrong, it's society that picks up the tabs. We know, for instance, that something like 40% of pregnancies in Britain, this is the estimates which the FP medics make, something like 40% are unplanned. That doesn't mean to say that they're unwanted. They may well become wanted subsequently. But unplanned is what is the point I wish to emphasize here, because I would suggest that if we are moving into a long-term future for the human species, then every child must be a child that's wanted from before conception. We know in Britain that we have the highest teenage pregnancy rate in Europe, second only to the States, where recently the right-wing Congress has just blocked a presidential initiative to tackle teenage pregnancy. They blocked it because it's, of course, from the religious right. So I'm asking that we have to treat human reproduction very seriously indeed. The arrival of a new human being on the planet is something that we really have to take very seriously. Now, many of the things I've said sound anti-democratic. Absolutely. They require much greater understanding from people around their reproductive rights, as we call them. What kind of a right is it to have as many children as you want? As I say, society eventually picks up the tab. So, the irony is that if we don't grasp these things well, I sense nasty trends within Britain. The beneficiaries of failing to tackle things in as best a manner as we can is that the right wing will increase. I'm quite sure of it. Now, I better make a disclaimer. Two disclaimers. First of all, there are alternatives, I reckon. If we really don't care about the rest of the planet and just want to move down the Fremlin path, of course not as far as the Fremlin path, but if we're prepared to devote all the resources that we can get with all the cleverness of technology into producing more human beings, we can do it. That's one way. It's obviously not a way that I would favour, because I'm concerned with the other living organisms as well as what they do for us. But the other disclaimer I must make, which I hope has become perhaps clear, that I actually like people. I really do. And I want the human species to go on. We've got possibly 3 billion more years of useful life out of the sun. We've only been on the planet in Homo sapiens at the maximum of 1/4 million. So we've got a future which is 12,000 times as long as the past we've had. And I would like us to have it. I like to think of us tiptoeing into that vast future. But I must conclude with somebody, quoting somebody whose view here is absolutely essential at all kinds of level, whether you're thinking about unemployment of young people, or economic growth, or population, or how to save the Sumatran rhino. Edmund Burke really would have been, he wasn't in the Enlightenment, as it were, but he was a contributor to it. And this is what he said. Oh, I don't want that. There. So, that's my view. I've deliberately, I've stuck my neck out. I've certainly said some things, and I would respond again and say that not necessarily population matters takes all that I say, but we can talk about it. Thank you very much.